Getting stream. Week in review, we will be discussing our last. As everyone rolls in here, I apologize. I made a welcome to the new studio, which has been upgraded. So thank you for my patriots on Patreon for helping me. But any day now, I would think it was supposed to be here like a week and a half ago. Everything else has showed up. So expect more changes, more good stuff to come. But let's get into the founders. You guys can enjoy the nice new view here, which I'm sure I will end up discussing at some point, most of the books and stuff in the background, how I built this collection. So thank you for coming. If you wanted to hit like, that would be fantastic. If you wanted to subscribe, you probably already have. That's how you know I'm live. I'm going to start with Thomas Jefferson and some grizzly bears, but you're going to have to forgive me for 1 second. I will be right back. Oh, hi, I'm back. Well, that's really unprofessional. Oh, someone left. I can understand why you would. So what happened there was I turned on my air conditioning because it gets very hot in this room. I have to close the windows so that the crickets outside don't ruin it. And I had to go turn it off because I forgot to turn it off before I started the stream. And I didn't want to bother everyone. I know it would have been a bother. Anyhoozle, I am going to talk about Thomas Jefferson and some grizzly bears, which I'm realizing this is the second straight week we're talking about an animal to start off. Last week it was a puma that killed a guy. Today, it's Thomas Jefferson and grizzly bears. So, what happened when Thomas Jefferson became president of the United States? And he was really curious about science and things like that. A group of explorers out west, Lewis and Clark. You've heard of them. So Lewis and Clark go out west, and they're, doing their thing. And while they're out there, they find some bears. And they're a lot bigger than the bears on the East Coast, and we know them today as grizzly bears. Now, Jefferson and his friends were not entirely sure of what was happening with things like what lived out there. Quality's a little off today. I'm not sure why that is. It looks like it might be. Again, next week we will have the webcam and won't have to worry about it. Anyway, Jefferson is very interested in these things. They find this woolly mammoth that his friend Charles Willson Peale, who was a famous portrait artist, and we know what many founders look like because Charles Willson Peale. Peale had established a curiosities museum in Philadelphia, the first of its kind, the first natural history museum that I understand in the world, definitely in the young United States. So Peale's over there with his museum, and he gets these woolly mammoth bones, and he actually puts the woolly mammoth bones together, which we are accustomed to seeing, going and seeing a Tyrannosaurus skeleton in a museum nowadays. Willson Peale was the first one to assemble the bones of an old-timey creature of this nature, which is very, very interesting. He's friends with Jefferson, who's also curious about this mammoth bone, and they're like, well, if there was this... Jefferson sent out Lewis and Clark on the Corps of Discovery. It wasn't just a, hey, well, let's go find the Pacific Ocean. Boats had been to the Pacific Ocean. They knew about the West Coast. It was, let's find out what's in the interior of the United States. One of the things they found was grizzly bears. Furthermore, one of the things, Jefferson had sent out another guy by the name of Zebulon Pike, who some of you might recognize the name. I wrote about him not too long ago, and I think I might have discussed him in one of these live reviews not too long ago. And Zebulon Pike went on 2 expeditions, the first of which he went out and came back while Lewis and Clark were on their expedition. He went to like Minnesota and such. And then he went on another one where he went further out west to Denver. He actually got captured because the Mexicans were saying he was in Mexico and shouldn't have been there, and the Corps of Discovery was technically a part of the U.S. Army at the time. Not a great look. He ends up getting released eventually. Mexico had problems, aka a revolution against Spain, which was more pressing. Now, the second expedition, Zebulon Pike meets a Native American who has some of these big bears they've been finding out west in captivity. He has 2 grizzly bears that he gives to Pike. And Pike decides this would be a great gift for President Jefferson. So he somehow gets these gigantic grizzly bears to Washington, D.C. and gives them to Jefferson as a present, who's fascinated by him. Again, as a person who's never left the West Coast, Jefferson had gone to Europe, but he had never gone really to the interior of the United States where there are grizzly bears. So to see these bears that are not twice the size, but much bigger than the black bears we have on the East Coast and significantly more aggressive, it was a fascinating event for him. So He says, I can't keep these. To do with them and stuff, because they didn't really know how dangerous they were. Luckily, it doesn't sound like anyone got hurt, but for 2 months, Thomas Jefferson had grizzly bears living on the front lawn of the White House. Now, before I mentioned Charles Willson Peale and his museum, the reason he's important is Jefferson decided what I'm going to do with these is give them to Charles Willson Peale. They waited 2 months on the front lawn of the White House while Willson Peale figured out where he would keep them, and he actually kept them in the Curiosity Museum for a while. Unfortunately, one of the 2 bears got out, because what Willson Peale wanted to study was how big they would actually get. How big do these guys grow? They were still young at that time. Unfortunately, one of them got out, destroyed a bunch of things in the museum, and had to be executed, because it was a wild grizzly bear in the middle of Philadelphia. It got shot. Now, the second one, the next thing you know, they are both taxidermied. I don't know how the second one died. It certainly seems like they said, enough is enough. Let's kill this. Matthew, thank you for letting me know your connection is bad. Everyone, I am getting a bunch of messages, and I'm not sure why. No data. The bit rates. Well, I apologize, everyone. It says, okay, health is excellent. See, I can't change it. Good connection? Are we good now? We look good now. I put the camera right in front of the screen because I'm like, oh, this is where the webcam will go when it comes in. Hopefully that's improved. Matthew, if you want to let me know if it's the sound quality too, or just the video. If it's the sound quality, I'll redo it. I can start it over. I'm really not entirely sure why my internet's good. I actually upgraded it recently, which might be the problem because, Time Warner Cable has a monopoly on my life. Oh, there it is again. Poor quality. Well, I'm going to power through it. If you guys can let me know if you can at least hear me. Okay, excellent. Now it's excellent. Time Warner, man. I wish I had another option other than space. So anyway. Yeah, no, I'm getting like warnings here, Matthew. Like it's telling me I'm having the problems too. So I do apologize. Now it says excellent condition. I'll keep an eye on it. Now it says warning. Bitrate low. Only good. I'm not sure why. All I did was add a screen to what I was using last week. So really, the changes I've made have not been significant enough to mess up the stream. I do apologize. So anyway, I don't want to bore you guys. Let's power through it. That's been essentially the story of Thomas Jefferson's grizzly bears. They end up as curiosities in Willson Peale's museum that is later purchased by a young P.T. Barnum, who starts The Greatest Show on Earth with the remnants of Willson Peale's aging museum a few decades later. So, let's move on to, maybe we'll have better luck with some anti-federalist papers. And today we're talking about the Impartial Examiner. Now, the Impartial Examiner was published in Virginia. The first one was published in the early 1788 in February of 1788, and then the next 4 out of 5 would be published in May and June of the following year, leading up to the Virginia Ratification Convention. Now, we don't know who the Impartial Examiner was. One of many anti-federalists will really never know who they are. But of the 5 papers, he said some very interesting things. The first one discusses the difference between arbitrary government and free government. And now he seems to be using a definition that is old. I saw a reference by even John Winthrop when he first came to the colonies. Essentially, arbitrary government is government where the government does wherever it wants and the people have no say. And a free government is a government which has to respond to the demands of the people. And the Impartial Examiner is saying almost everyone who fought in the American Revolution, all of the founders, we all agree that it should be a free government. But because of the way it harkens back to the one we had a few weeks ago, I believe it was Montezuma, who said essentially like, we're rushing this, we need to take our time with this. Kind of reflecting those. He was also unhappy there was no Bill of Rights, which he thought was very important. In the second essay, he says a few interesting things. Mostly he's talking about how all of the discussions are meaningless. excuse me 1 second, I've now gone to poor quality. YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. That's very peculiar. Well, I'm going to power through it. In number 2, he says the arguments about the Constitution are meaningless because, well, it's an arbitrary government. So we shouldn't be talking anti-federalist. He says we shouldn't be called anti-federalists. We're not anti-federalists at all. We are pro-federation. We want a federated government. Now, the definitions of things like national and federate and federal, confederate, they're too super far off to help each other defend from foreign invaders, maybe some financial help, but not really. That's basically it, was fight together if someone invades. Now, everyone agreed there were problems with the Articles of Confederation, and the people labeled anti-federalists wanted a federation. They wanted separate independent states that came together in certain circumstances. They wanted to have this one unified government in the middle that could do certain things, but most of the power being left to the states. And the argument that the Examiner has is that, well, we want the Constitution isn't a federal government of separate states working together. It's a national government where the separate states are a part of the national government, but the government's a you actually hear the anti-federalists saying, no, we're federalists. You're nationalists. We're federalists. And don't let me saying the word nationalist come off wrong. Nationalism has taken on a much different tone through the 19th and into, through the 20th and into the 21st century than it did at the time. A national government wasn't, didn't have such overpowering connotations. Although the anti-federalists, who were calling themselves federalists, did foresee it going poorly. Now, the impartial examiners, numbers 3, 4, and 5, are not really that important to the historical context, but we'll go over them real quick. The third letter goes over the House of Representatives and says this does not represent people. There's not nearly enough representatives in the House of Representatives. At the time, I don't remember the exact number, but the first Congress would only have like 2 or 3 dozen people in it. And he thought that was not nearly enough to represent 2.5 million or so citizens. What's interesting about this argument is he wanted more people there, but we actually today don't follow the Constitution's original provision. I don't know all the laws that have changed how we count and have changed how counting population and turning it into delegates has changed over the years. But if we were to follow the original Constitution's recommendation of 1 representative for every 30,000 people, we would currently have, give or take, 11,500 people in the House of Representatives. And if you think it's busy now with, 335, imagine there were 11,000 people trying to crowd into Congress to get things done. Now, it would be more democratic, and that was the impartial examiner's argument in his third paper. His fourth paper, he argues that the president has too much power. The veto, he could cancel everything and essentially assume all the power by vetoing. And in number 5, he says the Articles of Confederation aren't that bad. And that was a more common argument at the time. Nowadays, we look at the Articles as an abject failure. Like, no way, the Articles of Confederation were wrong. Everything about them was garbage. I'm glad they're gone. And that's not fair. They were done very quickly. They were compromise. It was a compromise government, as was the United States Constitution. Although the United States Constitution took a summer of, 3 months of 40 people in a room, 2 years, and there was a war to win and a lot of other things going on in the minds of the people creating it. Furthermore, it took about 3 years of signings and approvals from the separate states to actually happen, as opposed to the United States Constitution ratification process that took less than a year. Technically, if you don't count North Carolina and Rhode Island, who came in a little bit late, the Articles of Confederation took about 3.5 years to get ratified. So it had a tough start, and the argument in number 5 by the impartial examiner is this isn't a bad government. It just needs some tidying up. It needs to be able to raise some money, and it needs to be able to raise an army. But the idea that, much of what's going on here is a good basis for a federated government. So that's, in essence, the Impartial Examiner. I hope, thank you everyone who's watching. I hope causing too much trouble with the stream being disobedient. Let's talk about James Duane. So Duane, he was sent to the 1974 of Association of the Revolution, a major founding document, and he would end up serving as a Continental Congressman through the entirety of the war till 1781. So 7 years he's a Continental Congressman. Now he's on and off. He does vote for independence, but he leaves to go back to New York, as many people went back to their home state. So he doesn't actually sign the Declaration a few months later, which is a bummer, but it was not the top thing on everyone's mind. He did come back and sign that Articles of Confederation we were talking about. And you might be thinking, hey, Jason, I thought you could only serve in the Continental Congress for 3 years, and that, which you are right, kind of. You could only serve 3 years in a 6-year period, and that was only after the Articles of Confederation was ratified, which, as I said, took a while, and didn't happen until 1781, which was the last of the 7 years James Duane served in the Continental Congress anyway, because he went back home, and he would be elected, among many other things. He helped establish New York along the way. I'm skipping a lot. But he was actually elected as the first post-war mayor of New York City. And that wasn't until 1784 when the British actually evacuated New York City, and the Patriots took over, and James Duane became mayor of New York City, and he was delegated with cleaning up the mess. I mean, you have the British there for 8 years, and then they leave, and empty up, and a lot of one here I want to talk about. It was called Rutgers versus Waddington, and the woman who was serving in the American Revolution. I'm sorry, she was a tavern owner in the Revolutionary period, and she evacuated with the Patriots when the British came to New York City. After the war, she went back to New York City and recollected her tavern that had been run by a loyalist for 8 years. And what she tried to do is sue this loyalist for financial gain. She wanted rent for the years he was occupied. Alexander Hamilton was arguing, no, we can't. She can't sue for rent because it's written in the Treaty of Paris that ended the war that civilians would be sued for things of this nature during their stay in New York City. And James Duane, this went to the mayor's court, which James Duane, as mayor, was in charge of. And that's a whole story in its own, how the mayor was justice of the court. But James Duane sat on this, and he ruled with Alexander Hamilton and the defense, saying you're absolutely right, we'd be breaking the Treaty of Paris and risk sending the United States back to war. This is in 1785 or 6, before the Constitution's around. And so the idea that, hey, this is an international treaty signed by the United States, and now the state of New York is obeying an international treaty signed by the whole of the United States. It's an extremely important step towards federalism, or nationalism if you're an anti-federalist, towards the Constitution. Because it was after the Constitution that these rules and laws signed by the United States government would be followed by the individual states. Until then, it was up in the air. They really didn't have to. Again, under the Articles of Confederation, these are separate nations. States, it means country. It means nation. They were separate nations. So the idea that one of these separate nations would follow the lead of the whole, which, to be fair, the Articles of Confederation, what everyone viewed it as, was a lead friendship. Then we're not just at peace with each other, but if someone goes to war with you, I'll go to war with them. So they wanted to help each other. That's the life of James Duane. I find him extremely interesting. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. We are running through this week pretty quick. I have the camera in a bad spot. I can't see how many. All right, 20 minutes. Not bad. Not bad. And I appreciate every single one who's sticking with me with these streaming problems I have. I've literally no idea why. It's the same computer from last week and the same telephone, same YouTube. Anyway, let's get to Ezekiel Cornell. Ezekiel Cornell was a guy from Rhode Island who was a merchant. I'm sorry, let me say that again. He was a mechanic, which essentially was in Rhode Island, but he worked very hard, he impressed his neighbors, and he was eventually elected to his town council and eventually elected to serve in the General Assembly while Rhode Island was still a colony. Now, he does side with the Patriots. He also joined the militia before the Revolution broke out. And after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, he goes and answers the bell and is appointed in the Continental Army as a colonel. Now, very quickly, he is sent to Long Island. While he's on Long Island, he is stationed, while most of the army's moving to like Brooklyn and Manhattan to prepare for the British invasion, Ezekiel Cornell is sent to Hempstead on Long Island, which was then in Queens County, was a great place for the British to make land. And Ezekiel Cornell is tasked with stopping, oh, excellent condition, great. He's tasked with stopping and to stop anyone who might plot anything against them. During this time, it is found out that a man named Thomas Hinckley who was a member of George Washington's Life Guards, run by Caleb Gibbs, which wasn't so much a secret service, it was his bodyguards, Washington's bodyguards, basically. One of these men was part of a plot to assassinate Washington. And this was found out, and Hinckley was arrested, and he gave up the name of the person he was working with. The person he was working with was the mayor of New York City. Not James Duane, who would be mayor of New York City later. The current loyalist mayor of New York City, Dave Matthews. Not from Dave Matthews Band. It's spelled a wee bit different. But Dave Matthews, the mayor of New York City. So, the British hadn't come yet. So, Cornell is ordered by Nathaniel Greene, I believe, to go into New York City and arrest the mayor of New York City. And he does that. He goes into New York, he arrests Dave Matthews, and brings him out back to Long Island, and then has him sent to Connecticut. Now, as a very wealthy person, Matthews had parole in Connecticut and eventually escaped and returned to New York and was acting as governor of New York again, even as a convict fleeing from the American Patriot Army. However, like I said, the British were coming, and things would be real cool for him after the British got there. That's the most interesting part of Ezekiel Cornell's life. He does go on to serve throughout the war for 5 years. He is a brigadier general. He makes his way up to brigadier general, making him one of the most important people with paroled with a death sentence. No. He never got sentenced to death. Sorry to jump over. Matthew asked if Cornell was paroled with a death sentence. No, I don't believe he was ever actually sentenced to anything. He was just being held more or less as a prisoner of war for the time. Again, the might of the British Army were just in the ships sitting in New York Harbor at this point. They spent several weeks just hanging out there, making sure the Patriots knew what was about to happen to them. 40,000 or so soldiers on boats just sitting there. So they were more preoccupied. I will look that up for you, Matthew. I'm going to write that down. Matthew's sentence, question mark. Was he sentenced? I don't remember what that means. Thank you. Great question. Either way, Cornell goes on to become a brigadier general, and he resigns to go and become a Continental Congressman. And he serves for several years in the Continental Congress. They're kind of fading out, not being more important to. And we are going to move on to Monday. I need to take one more sip. It is hot. Now that I turn the AC off, it warms up very quickly with these lights and me talking so much. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you for liking and subscribing and supporting the channel in the room. John Dickey. John Dickey is a guy who played in a tremendous part in a battle and then kind of like disappears. There's very little information, at least online, which is where I get most of my information about the obscure founders, about John Dickey. There is a poem, though, and the poem goes like this. Old Colonel Locke kept pretty well back, while brave Captain Dickey commenced the attack. He, Colonel Locke, ordered us to retreat and reform, which made our old hero North Carolina Militia. I apologize. Glad I checked. Captain Dickey was a captain in the North Carolina Militia, and he was fighting in the Battle of... He fought in several battles all over the South. Now, at Ramser's Mill, Griffith Rutherford, a brigadier general who we spoke about last week, sent Colonel Francis Locke and his captain, John Dickey, to fight at Ramser's Mill, to attack some British over there. Now, it wasn't really British. It was a group of loyalists versus militia. So these people knew each other and were close to each other. In fact, during the Battle of Ramser's Mill, there's accounts of people running out of ammunition and attacking their neighbor with the butt of their gun. Now, let me see if I remember this story straight. And this isn't Dickey. I'm stepping aside from Dickey for a second. It is a legendary tale, where a gentleman saw a guy with a gun and said, "Whatever, my neighbor, I'd never strike you." And he said, "Well, I'm going to strike you." And he swung the butt of his gun. And the guy dodged it and said, oh, well, I'm not just going to stand here and let you kill me. And then before he started going at him, and another guy put a gun here and got him that way. And they were neighbors. And like the one guy was literally like, "I don't want to kill you. I know you." And the guy's like, "I'm a patriot. I'm fighting for my country. You can die for your king if that's what you're into." So that's what Ramser's Mill was. As for Dickey, he's there and it's gotten very crowded, and then his men started sniping, because I suppose I didn't see a lot about this, but I suppose as was becoming a new thing during the Revolution, many of these people had not muskets. It was, again, this is a newer invention. They were using bullets that were... I'm not an expert in weapons, but my understanding is they were curved barrels, so when you shot the bullet, it would spiral like a football, which made you able to hit a target easier and at a greater distance. So because of this, Captain Dickey leads his men up to a hill and starts picking off the British. And Dickey is almost single-handedly able to lead this group of men to turn the tide of this losing battle and win at Ramser's Mill, which again was a chaotic, messy scene, but they were able... Real quick, there's not a lot of information that I could find about him, but I'm surprised he was treated as a hero afterwards, which makes it super surprising we can't find out more about him, but even more surprising, he strictly disobeyed an order, but he doesn't seem to have been reprimanded. In an army that order was very important to these people, he should have been court-martialed, but it certainly doesn't seem that he was, probably because he got lucky and won the battle. So that is Captain John Dickey. If you have any questions, TJ, welcome aboard. Your internet has been on and off. I apologize. Apparently, I'm having some troubles today too. I don't know why. I wish I did. I would fix it better. Right now it's good, but every time I've said it's good, it has been bad. I mean, we'll see. So, this is the first sheriff in Ohio, Ebenezer Sproat. Okay, Ebenezer Sproat's a weird one that I kind of stumbled on. A few really interesting off the beaten path ones this week. Sproat is some guy who I stumbled on, whose parents owned a tavern, didn't come from much, but he was very tall, pretty handsome, and apparently a very nice guy. On top of that, he seemed to be a very good soldier, because he was just the son of a tavern owner when he joined the American Revolution. Now, Ebenezer Sproat would serve in the Continental Army from before there was a Continental Army. He would serve for 8.5 years. So from 2000, not a lot of people could say this. Kind of George Washington, although I think he left a few days early even. Henry Knox. But like when it comes to the rank and file, not a lot of people serve for 8.5 years. That's a long part of your life. Now, he was commissioned as an officer early on and steadily made his way up the ranks. Now, I don't recall exactly how high he made it. He was never a general or anything like that. But he ended, he made his way up. There are many stories about him, as I said, oral traditions that don't have a lot of physical backing, but one of them was, first of all, this is fact, he helped suppress the mutiny of the New Jersey line, and he served on the court-martial that ended up executing two of the people on the New Jersey officers. It was the right call. Again, this was an army that cared about order. So it was the right thing to do, even if he felt very guilty about it. But to show what a nice guy was, we'll tell a different story about him. Sproat was on furlough back at his parents' house at their tavern, and a few soldiers came in who said, ate dinner, and we're going to leave, and they said, hey, how much do we owe you? And apparently, Ebenezer Sproat said, about $1 each man, and gave all of them $1 and said, be on your way. Because they were fighting for their country, and they deserved not just the meal, but more than the meager pay that Continental soldiers were getting. Because now, did go to, he ended up moving to Rhode Island and started a family there, and things were great. And he did know, Matthew, thank you for bringing that up. I've not written about Abraham Whipple. I did see his name while I was researching Sproat. I'm very impressed you brought that up. I actually left Abraham Whipple out of even being mentioned in the article because I didn't have a link for his name, and I was angry because I've come across his name so many times over the years. I still have not determined if he's related to William Whipple of North Carolina, and that's what's slowing me down a little bit. North Carolina, New Hampshire, and that's what's slowing me down a little bit. Reference. And then he ends up joining Rufus Putnam and several others in the Ohio Company of Associates. And the Ohio Company decides, hey, we're going to go start a town in Ohio. And that's what they did. They were essentially pioneers, which David McCullough, who's won several Pulitzer Prizes, writes in a not Pulitzer Prize winning book, Pioneers, which I super week is this, and put it as the recommendation this week, because it's talking about Ohio in the Northwest Territory, and we're talking about, like, before Washington becomes president. These people are buying land in the 1780s from the Continental Congress, essentially, or Congress of the Confederation, to go settle this land out west. So he goes out west and joins his company, and they Marietta and appointed the first sheriff in Ohio, and it's a big chunk of Ohio, parts of Michigan, a huge territory he's sheriff of, which again, word of mouth, oral tradition stories say that when he would go out to arrest people for not having enough money, he talked to them, and if he really thought that like they were just poor and couldn't afford it, he would pay for them. Instead of arresting these people, he would go back and pay their fines out of his own pocket. And he did that for about a decade. Retired farm in the Northwest Territory. So that is Ebenezer Sproat, the tallest guy, who served for 8.5 years. I very rarely do I come across any fact. Excuse me. So I'm going to take one sip of my water, and then I'm going to tell you about a plot to kidnap King George III. Okay, so Stephen Sayre is a name I've run into on several occasions and never really dug into until earlier this week. Stephen Sayre was an American born in New York and a merchant, and he was a schemer and an adventurer and a shifty, shady person, but he was technically a patriot. So he goes to England well before the Revolutionary War in the 17th. He is doing several things. Oh, he's actually elected. Oh, get this. Speaking of sheriffs, he's elected sheriff of London. This American, this New York-born colonial, is elected sheriff of London. People liked him. He also started a banking company with William Lee, who I was surprised to realize when I was trying to link to the name William Lee. I have not written an article about William Lee, so expect to discuss William Lee next week. He is one of the Lee family of Virginia. I'll leave it at that. But business partners with William Lee, starts a bank, starts speaking out against the crown. He starts speaking for colonial rights. In fact, when the Boston Port Act is passed, and this is how I ran into it, I was researching someone else who also signed these papers. When the Boston Port Act was passed, essentially putting Boston under military dictatorship, the Americans in London, of which there were about 1,000, the leaders of that group came together and, as they did at the time, wrote 3 letters, one to the House of Commons, one to the House of Lords, and one to the King. Stephen Sayre signed all 3 of these. His is the first name signing all 3 of these. Now, about a year and a half later, the war has broken out, and Sayre is in London, and we don't really know what happened. But, allegedly, Sayers hatches a plan to kidnap King George III. We find out about this plan because, allegedly, he went to, colonists could join the British Army. They were British at this point. And there was an American colonist who had joined the British Army. And Sayre, apparently, assumed he would be a little bit more friendlier to the Americans than he was to the British. Despite, getting paid by the king. So, allegedly, Sayre goes to this gentleman and says, listen, I'm going to kidnap the king when he's on his way to open Parliament this year. I want to hold him in the Tower of London. Can you make sure there's no one around here and just let him in so I can, put the kidnapped monarch in the tower? So asking me to help kidnap the king and hold him in the tower. I guess we're gonna shoot off all the rest of the British army who are just gonna come here from down the street and take him back. This is the craziest thing I've ever heard. And so Sayre was arrested immediately. Held in the tower himself for 5 days before he had a pretty hefty fine, he paid a pretty hefty bail. Now, the name escapes me of the person who had him arrested. It was one of the members of the King's Council. People distanced themselves from him. The rest of the council, all the politicians distanced themselves from the whole thing because, well, there was no proof. It was just the guy's word of mouth. Now, there was a kind of secret service in Britain during this time, and they were watching Sayre because he was obviously not to be trusted. But these people were, they were British. They, much like the Patriots were complaining about, they considered themselves the freest country in the world, and you can't just arrest someone without a warrant. So that's why he was released so quick on bail. He actually ended up getting his money back very quickly. But he was never pressed charges, and what Sayre did is he sued the government in an effort to, damages or those lines. Nothing comes of that either, but the whole thing is fascinating because either Sayre was super reckless in an attempt to kidnap the king, or Sayre was trying to get arrested to prove, look at this monarch, look at this dictatorship. He's just arresting people without any proof. I've seen arguments for both. I have not actually formed my opinion on that. So why don't you leave a comment, let me know what you think it might have been the case. But Sayre is very interesting because not soon after this, or very soon after this, Sayre's company goes bankrupt and he goes bankrupt again. He had financial trouble most of his life. He ends up deciding, I'm going to be a diplomat for the United States. Now, the Continental Congress hasn't appointed me, but I'm going to be one. So he goes to Russia and tries to meet and never associated her with the American Revolution. She was in charge of Russia during the American Revolution. Now, Catherine ends up being not important. She doesn't want to do anything. That's a whole other story. You know, maybe I'll have Francis Dana. I'll talk about Francis Dana soon and the League of Armed Neutrality with Catherine the Great. But Sayre goes to hang out with Catherine the Great and doesn't get anywhere, and she's not interested. He spends about a year there. He then travels around Europe trying to be a self-appointed diplomat. His goal was to recruit finances and arms for the Continental Army, to be fair, but because he knew he could skim a lot off the top and make a lot of money. Before you say, oh, that's really corrupt and scumbaggy, that is kind of what happened back in the day. Although it wasn't exactly great, if we look at Silas Deane, he was accused of doing just that, even though he really didn't. That's another story. Though with the Lee family and Silas Deane, I'll have to talk about all of that. But, sticking with Sayre, he would go to France during the French Revolution and really support the French Revolution. Although he is now a diplomat because the American by the time of the French Revolution. So Sayre decided to act as a diplomat on behalf of Britain, who again didn't ask him to be a diplomat. He just took it upon himself. He was really a big fan of the French Revolution until a little bit into the Terror, where he was like, okay, even for me this is a little much. So Sayre then comes back to the United States after decades away, moves to Philadelphia, and starts talking a lot of trash about the federal government, because he gets here just, they've signed the Constitution. He was too late to be an anti-federalist, but he was anti-administration, which was a short-lived party between anti-federalists and the Democratic Republicans. There was anti-administration for a minute there. He was real quick to award him a position. I'm not going to pay you for being so mean to me in public. And what happens is Sayre ends up essentially retiring to his son-in-law's farm in Virginia. Caused a lot of trouble. Interesting cat. I'm surprised I didn't know more about him going into this. So, that's the last founder this week. If you were wrapping up, if you guys have any questions, now's the time. I do want to give a shout out to the book of the week, which I put down below, which is The Anti-Federalist. Now, this is it's writings by the opponents of the Constitution. This is selections from the Complete Anti-Federalist. Now, the Complete Anti-Federalist is almost impossible to get your hands on. I've looked all over the internet, and I don't know where else I would go to buy the Complete Anti-Federalist. Don't have any bookstores around anymore. But it's very interesting. So the Complete Anti-Federalist is by one of his students, Herbert Storing, published that for him. And this book is published by Herbert Storing with selections from the Complete Anti-Federalist. It boils it down to really some of the most important intellectual writings. I've been using this to do the weekly Anti-Federalist. For most of it, I've been getting the information out of here. Though, to be fair, most of it is just old-timey writing and the Anti-Federalist, but it gives a nice introduction. So if you're interested in learning more about the Anti-Federalist, I have a link in that description below for that. Other than that, if you guys don't have any questions, what time are we at? I put the camera in the wrong spot. 46 minutes, it's about normal. A little short. Talk a little quick. You guys want me to chat about something else? Look at this studio. I put a lot of work into this. Believe it or not. Again, thank you to my supporters on Patreon who not only made this possible. A lot of this was just me moving stuff around my house, but I have the new monitor and a new microphone and a new. Whenever the mail starts working again, I will get a new webcam. Thanks, TJ. Thank you. I like it. I'm putting the camera here. I might have it over here. I'm not sure yet. I'm trying this out. I think straight on this adds a lot of depth, right? Does it look like I'm further away from the wall than I am? Cozy. It does feel cozy. It's funny. I put some books up here. There's probably more going up. But the other day, I was at it all day Saturday, and finally I sat down. I sat down, and I turn around this way, and I look, and I'm like, that. I am going to go, though, I apologize if the quality is poor. I'm not an internet whiz. I read history books. I'm trying my best. But I do appreciate you guys coming and liking and definitely subscribing and all of your support. So thank you again. It keeps cutting out. Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. I apologize. But hopefully next week we have better luck because I'll have a whole new setup. So thank you so much, and I will be back with you with another founder tomorrow. So round bottom.